What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and in today's video, I'm going to be continuing the poker hand review series with today's video, as the last few weeks have, covering one no limit hold'em hand and then one PLO hand, trying to cover both games to give players who are a fan of each game or possibly both games, a couple hands to satisfy their needs. So let's start with the live 2-5 no limit hand. I have a loose bad player who limps under the gun +2. I make a, Snowy telling me I'm wrong, I know. I make a pretty loose, and by pretty loose, I think it's a little too loose of an ISO. My thinking here is this player limp calls too much, and then he's pretty easy to play against post-flop. It's not so much that it's because he's like ABC, but he takes weird lines and he doesn't rep anything often, so it's pretty easy for me to kind of figure out where I'm at and then go from there. The player on the button, I think, overly respects my raises a lot of the time, so I think I'm getting folds here often, and then the big blind's just a tighter player in general. So I thought this had a good chance of picking up position and getting this player heads up. Even so, I think this is a little too loose. I think 10-8 suited would be probably okay, but I think when we're getting to these three gaps, it's getting a little wide. So a little loose, but I end up getting lucky in the sense that I do ISO him and get very lucky in flop trips. And so I think it's a very easy spot to go ahead and c-bet. I c-bet for half pot essentially because I'm going to want to do this with the parts of my range that miss essentially when I'm trying to get folds. I do think I have a lot of fold equity on these paired boards. Players don't defend on these paired boards properly. I also think that this player views me as more loose and aggressive, and I think he may just think to himself, I just can't have that many value hands on this type of texture. So I do think I'm going to get a lot of action on this board, and he does go ahead and make the call. Jack of Diamonds turns, pretty irrelevant card for the most part. I don't think he's floating with any Jack X hands. I definitely think if it's a card that helps anybody, it definitely helps me. It hits my range. It's a dynamic card in the sense that it changes what often the nuts are as far as what's not 7X. And I apologize for my dishwasher's stupid noise there. But anyway, so very interesting situation. He leads half pot into me. Now, it's interesting because I'm trying to figure out what he's doing with this line. He's pretty much saying he has a 7, which you have to be careful when you are trying to represent such a narrow range because it's just really hard for him to have 7X at this point. It's just kind of rare. And I don't think he's taking a hand like pocket 6s or pocket 8s and all of a sudden taking this line and trying to bet here. I also would think it's really weird if he's trying to tell me he has a jack. So I do think his range is kind of empty in the spot. I think that because of that, and because I don't think I really need any protection at all, and I don't think I'm going to get value as far as a raise goes, then I just like a call here. And Snowy suggests a raise if I am going to go with like a standard sizing, but Snowy also assumes that this player is playing optimally, and he is not. So I do think it's a spot where call makes more sense than raise. And we see a river of an 8 of clubs. And the loose and bad player checks, which I'm going to take that as two ways. One, he thinks he just has no fold equity. He tried some weird bluff on the turn. He's just giving up. Or it's very possible that he has 9-8 or he has 8-6. Those combos would make sense to be played this way possibly. So I think that because of that, I do really well by making a block bet because I think it's going to do essentially one of two things. I think he'll either call with 8X quite often, or I think it may induce him into making a spewy play because I think this player is capable of making some kind of weird play like that. I think that this is a nice spot to consider making more of these kinds of bets when I think players in the spot just get to the river this way and they think, well, he checked to me, I've got trips, I block the straight, I'm going to go ahead and fire large because I have a nice hand. You got to think about how his range is constructed, though, and what he ends up having by the river at this point. And it's simply just air and then pretty much like 8X to me, possibly. So I think the 8X will call. I think the air will be induced into making a weird raise sometimes, which I can easily call. And I think it's a really profitable way to play the river here. So pretty interesting hand. If you're in your opponent's shoes and you take weird lines like this, be mindful of what you represent and what you're trying to accomplish. I think he just took a shot on the turn to try to get me to fold somehow, but like I said, I don't think he's a very competent player. I don't think he thinks about the game on any kind of deep level or anything. So yeah, interesting hand, and just be aware of what you represent. Let's get into the PLO hand. So I open pre-flop for pot, essentially. It was a 2-2 game, but I think there's a straddle in there, so I just made it 2-5. I open for pot, and player on the button calls. He's pretty straightforward for the most part, and I also think that he will overfold on future streets. So that's the only real reads I have on him, besides being just, I think, a weaker PLO player overall. But the flop comes 6-5 deuce, so a light texture, one that I don't hit that well. I do have the gutter and some back doors, so I think it's a decent hand to consider check call. You could argue check raise, but I just don't think I rep a whole lot on this board. I also think that he has somewhat of the range advantage in a sense that he is calling a little wider pre-flop. I do think he can hit this board decently well. So I think with the back doors and the gutter, this is a decent hand to consider as part of like a check call and then possibly like a reverse float. It could be a little fancy, but this player's not going to put me in tough spots. It's going to be very easy to play against him. So I do think there's merit to this line. So I do go ahead and check. And as you guys can see on the right here, I have his range broken up into these subsets to where I have his basically his bet calling range, where he would bet and call a check raise essentially. I've got his bet folding range, and then I've got his check back range. So he does go ahead and check, and as far as his range is concerned, I have him having stuff like pocket aces and pocket kings. I think most players would 3-bet aces most of the time, but let's just say he has those sometimes. Those don't need as much protection, and he may go ahead and bet a little more merged in this spot, which means that there might be more merit to a check raise then. But like I said, I know a little bit about this player, but I don't want to be too biased, I guess, in my assessment of him. So I'm going to include like basically some overpairs, gutters, stuff that I think he might check back trying to realize his equity. So what I'm going to do on the flop here is put in that subset, run it, just so you guys can see it. It's going to be a little more organized here. You can see how I'm doing against that specific subset. And I only have about 38% equity, so it's not like I'm super pumped to continue with this hand. However, because I think he caps himself, because I think he's not balanced enough with his check back range, I think it's going to be easy to blow him off of his hand on many turns and rivers. So turn comes an ace of diamonds. Good card for me to go ahead and bet. I think I could have a lot of ace X in my range. Obviously, I have the gutter and diamonds now, so I do think as far as his range is constructed, I think he'd probably raise ace 5 plus in this spot, call with a lone ace, call with some diamonds, call with an ace that has the wheel gutter and possibly with diamonds. And then I'm going to have the rest of his range as far as his air here. So, or at least his range that's going to be his folding range is what I should say. So I do go ahead and fire pot, basically trying to maximize fold equity. And we'll go ahead and run his range on the turn here. And as you guys can see, I'm expecting to get folds about 34% of the time. So combine that with my actual raw equity, and this is going to be a profitable play. And if he continues, then we're going to go ahead to the river and basically bet the right cards and decide there. But I'm pretty much going to be at the bottom of my range most of the time if I miss on the river. So I'm probably expecting to bet, trying to blow him off of a capped range. He does go ahead and call, so we will go ahead and give him subset B here, which is going to be his calling range. I'll run it real quick just to show you guys how this works again. Yeah, and so you can see here, this could be his calling range. Obviously, I'm not doing very well against that range, but I'm still reliant on river fold equity. And the immediate play was going to be profitable because I was expecting to get folds about 34% of the time. So we see a river of queen of hearts, and I don't love that I blocked diamonds, but I am at the bottom of my range. I do think I can get him to overfold an ace at this point. I think he's only going to possibly call pot when he has 2 pair plus. That could be a dangerous assumption, but I have seen this player overfold and show his hand a few times, so I do have a little bit of a read in the spot. And if we're going to look at his range here again, I've got him calling with 2 pair plus, and then essentially folding everything else. So if I'm laying him 2-1 essentially when I bet pot here, I'm going to need him to fold a little bit more than 50% of the time. And if I think he's folding ace X hands essentially and only calling with 2 pair here, fearing that for some reason it's PLO and I can rep anything, then I think I'm getting a fold about 72% of the time. And like I said, this could be a generous assumption, but I can definitely rep turned ace-ace. I think some of the time I can rep some ace-queen combos. I can rep slow played sets or possibly straights that might have gone for check raise. Now, I shouldn't have a lot of that in the range. I shouldn't really have 4-3 in my range at all, but I think how this opponent and how many novice opponents in PLO think is he just thinks that's PLO and I can have 4 cards so I can have anything. And so I do think there is that added fold equity, and I do think I get a fold more often than not. So be careful with this kind of line. You really need to know your opponent if you're going to make these kinds of assumptions and have, you're going to want to have specific reads to make these kinds of assumptions essentially. But if you do have a competent opponent, one that can balance his check back range, one that understands range versus range interaction and how my range is constructed, then you need to be a little more careful about, what types of hands you're going to be bluffing in this sense. So if you guys have any questions or comments about either of the hands, the no limit or the PLO, go ahead and let me know. Until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.